then of course it's not all beautiful and no problems with the EU. There's also problems, and that's definitely also in the news. So you can talk about the difficulties of this process, of actually gathering countries together in something that will try to prevent war. And 28 countries, it's going to be very difficult. So this is one of the crises. There have been many crises, not just one. And there was also a crisis in the 50s, another in the 60s. It's a succession of crises, really, that the European nations solve and then move forward. It's sometimes very difficult. So that was one of the crises. A treaty establishing a constitution for Europe was proposed and was rejected by two of the founding countries of the EC, France and the Netherlands. So then, in the end, what happened is, even though this treaty was rejected, about 95%, almost 95% of it, found itself in the next treaty, the Lisbon Treaty, which then was signed and came into force, but not without difficulties. I can't go into all of this. So what happened is it's very democratic to actually then vote on something that some citizens rejected in the past and recycle 94% into a new treaty. Again, discussion about that. The Eurozone crisis, of course we have to talk about this as well. What are the difficulties? How does it affect particular countries? So chosen here to focus on Greece, Italy, Portugal, Spain and Ireland. They're frequently in the news. What are the consequences for these countries? And then try to compare perhaps with the unemployment rate. So you can see that some countries are doing very badly, and others are doing very well, like Germany. So what's happening again? That can spark discussion and can keep going for quite some time. Again, so youth unemployment. So it's a bit smooth. And then that's on the positive side. We have the Nobel Peace Prize. So the EU was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize for over 6 decades, having contributed to the advance of peace and reconciliation, democracy and human rights in Europe. Here you can start a discussion of, was this the right idea? There's been a lot of controversy. If you go to the website of the Nobel Foundation in Glasgow, you'll see some of the comments. Some are very positive, some are very negative. Some are calling the Nobel Committee idiots for having given the prize. But it's an interesting discussion, right? If you look at the way some of the founding fathers looked at this project for European unification, they really tried to find a way to prevent war, but also at the same time to make sure that this project would continue to be supported by the citizens, and the leaders of their country, so that it would be in their interest as well. See, so it's not very easy, but they thought that would be the only way to make it work. So you can again try to talk about this as a Nobel Peace Prize, okay, and then you go beyond the EU and you say, okay, so very nice. We've talked about the EU, but it is not Europe actually. There are different ways of looking at this. The Eurovision, everybody's heard of the Eurovision, right? You may like it, you may not like it, that's different. It's definitely an event. We talk about it in Australia as well. And then you'd see a different map from the EU map. So you can look at many different maps here. And then you can look at sport. There your students will be more enthusiastic as well. And there again, you have a different map if you talk about football, for example. Here's another kind of Europe we talk about, right? So this is to spark a discussion, it's the beginning, and then you can dig deeper. NATO map as well is another way to look at Europe, not just, but this is the members of the EU that are perhaps part of NATO, other European members. Then you end with questions and you have a stimulating discussion. And I'll end here because I'm sure Bruce is going to stop me anyway. And so thank you very much. So it's for you to adapt in any way that you want, and we're happy to provide additional material as well if you would like. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Pascaline. Pascaline says, questions, comments, feedback? What sorts of thoughts does that prompt for you?
Well, I come from a small country town, and most we really are worried about Europe these days is the exports for agriculture, and also the crisis about, this is the crisis for Greece and Spain, Portugal, is that going to affect the banking for us?
And where could you get, your question would be about how to make sense of that. Could you say something more about the common agricultural policy?
Common agricultural policy is a long story. It's been reformed, but not enough to the taste of some. So it's periodically reformed. So certainly what you could say is that the EU is spending less money on it than it used to in the past.
And subsidizing farmers.
Yeah, there's less of that happening. So the EU is behaving better as a citizen here, but as I think an American official used to say, we're all sinners in agriculture. We're all trying to protect our farmers, and they're very, very vocal as well. They organize really well. So there's a specific organization that they have in Brussels, or frequent demonstration. So politically, it's very difficult also for some of the European leaders to completely, I guess, fit in the international economy that way. But there have been huge changes made to the infamous CAP. And also you have to understand where this all comes from. Why do we have a common agricultural policy? Europe wanted to make sure that, I don't know if you remember, but after the Second World War, there was actually famine in Europe. So never again. They really wanted to make sure that this would not happen again. But unfortunately, it created all kinds of problems, overproduction, and so on and so on, and cost a lot of money to the EU as well, not just to the international community. So we're still trying to address that. I mean, it's not easy, but you have to understand, I guess, the domestic realities here.
Nina from the ANU Centre.
What was your name again, sorry?
Linda.
Linda. So I also get a lot of questions in my own work on this from friends from Australia. Actually, in the current treaty negotiations, that was one of the concerns raised. And from 2013, there won't be any more subsidies for exports, as I'm aware, that Australia should be afraid of. So the European Commission ensured Australia that from 2013, after the negotiations are finished, that won't be any more a problem for us and them. And in terms of Euro crisis, I guess Pascaline is more of an expert on that, but Australian newspapers often portray a far worse picture. So actually in Australia we think, Greece is literally falling apart, the world is coming to an end where it started in Greece pretty much. So where in fact it's not as bad as we think, because of the Australian Financial Review and a lot of skeptical newspapers like that portray a very negative picture. But as we all know, when you have a great success in life, you don't necessarily publicize it, but all your problems are very well known. So it's that sort of a mentality. So just to keep an eye out also for good stories, not just bad stories.
Yeah, I guess there is the saying that good news is good news.
I think part of the issue with the way in which issues come to our attention is, as Nina and Pascaline have said, it's through particular incidents like the calling out of debt. But I think one of the really useful things about Pascaline's overview is that it does give you some indication of the different kinds of elements to how the European Union operates and the complexity of the decision making within the EU. For a start, you're talking about member states. One of the first points Pascaline made of her own comments about Belgium research. The member states are still sovereign member states. We're not talking about situations where they are like our own state governments, which are clearly subordinated to a national framework of decision making. They are sovereign member states. They come together to pool elements of their sovereignty, which is what enables the European Union to act in various spheres, like agriculture, like regional policy, like now foreign policy. And so you've got this extraordinary process of both national decision-making going on within the member states, and then the processes of those member states coming together within the framework of the European Union to be making decisions about something like the common agricultural policy. So it's not as though you've got kind of a simple process of officials sitting in the European Commission and just making all this up. It's an intense process of negotiation. And you have got a significant range of institutions which both allow for that complex process of negotiation and control it. So the courts, for example, are one way of actually ensuring that there is compliance with the decisions that are made. Sorry.
Do you think that lack of centralisation is an inherent weakness in the EU? The fact that some policies are centralised, some aren't? For example, there's no centralised fiscal policy, yet there's a centralised monetary policy.
Well, I think part of the process that's occurring now is recognition that when the euro was introduced, that there weren't the overall framework of fiscal and monetary arrangements that individual nation states typically have available to them. And that's part of the reform process occurring now, is to work out what's needed at the supranational level. But when the first part of your question, is that a weakness or not? Personally, I wouldn't make that judgment. I think it's a topic of debate. But you need to think about the European Union as an utterly unique kind of supranational entity. One which, at some point in the future, might look like a complex federated state, but it's not there yet, and it might not ever be like that. It's an attempt by a group of nations within the European space, territory, geography, to work out what they have to gain from pooling sovereignty and what they have to gain from retaining their own member state sovereignty. So you're always going to get that tension, and partly because obviously the 28 to be member states have different views on that. The United Kingdom has a very different view on what it's willing to pool in the interest of Europe than does, for example, let's pick Luxembourg or Malta, let alone France or Germany. Germany clearly is, in the way in which our media represents the decision-making in Europe at the present time, holding many cards at the table. But it still needs, in most of the forums, 28 votes, unanimity for decisions to get made. And ultimately, that's part of the strength of Europe, I think, rather than its weakness.
I think one reason why the EU often has a negative image in Australia is that most Australians only speak English, and the press comes from London, and so the view of Europe is in many ways a British view, and the British view in turn is shaped by Mr. Murdoch and his powers, and he is particularly anti-EU. So that as a consequence of us realizing that, our image is misformed, is misrepresented. It would be better, in a sense, if the Australian press got its information from the Neue Zürcher Zeitung in Switzerland, which would be much more evenly balanced and reported on the EU. They would still be critical, but it would be a different sort of criticism.
Yeah, that really, your comment reinforces the point that Nina made before. Our centre at RMIT did some work on exactly what you were talking about last year, and it has a very London-centric focus to the report in Australia. It's pretty true.
Just a side issue, but agriculture's been mentioned twice, which I'm really happy about. But the thing is that what I like with the EU is the GM policy. So are they still sticking to the guns of not increasing the GM, like as in other trade sectors? Genetic modification.
Yeah, containing it.
Yeah, so they're not going to follow the trends of America, etc., etc.
As far as
I really hope not.
They're still sticking to it.
Good. Excellent.
Yes.
Yeah, my name is Edgar. I'm also from the ANU. I just wanted to give you an idea of what's on your question, the level of European integration compared to the federal state. You can see about, very simple, it's not 100% correct what I said, but it gives an idea where you are. There are policy fields we have a lot of integration, and policy fields we have no integration. Fiscal policy you mentioned, which is on the way. If you look to Australia, you have a federal budget which is about 26% of the GDP. Okay? The US federal budget is about 28% of GDP. The EU budget is 1%. So it shows you a little bit, gives you a rough idea where we stand in the level of integration of the process, where we're going to. And the 1% will be debated now very much for the next financial period. So that there are policy fields like the military, where the European competence is very, very limited. There are policy fields like agriculture or regional policy or others where we have a lot of cooperation. So I think that is an important message to say we are still on the way, but we are still very much at the beginning. So 1% compared to 26 and 28.
Thanks, Andrew. Others? Well, that's an introductory session that perhaps raises some questions which we can come back to over the next few days. But certainly if you've got thoughts that are partly formed that you might want to ask as a question.
I'm just really interested in youth unemployment. I think the students will be really interested in youth unemployment, particularly the extraordinary figures in Spain and Greece. And does that become part of EU policy, or are the member states left to deal with that issue on their own?
Well,
because there are long-term consequences, aren't there, for youth unemployment? So, yeah.
The short answer is both. I mean, clearly, especially considering what Ed is saying, if you're looking at resources, then it's the member states that bear the direct responsibility. But Europe clearly has a major interest in the overall framework of unemployment. One of the things that characterises the direction of the EU at the present time is agreement around a strategy which was referred to as Europe 2020. And the three key elements of that are smart, sustainable and inclusive. That's the catch, the slogan, if you want to put it that way. And underneath the slogan, they've identified quite specific targets, not just kind of aims, but they've got targets that they want Europe to achieve by 2020. And employment and reduction of poverty are two critical targets. I think of five, just from my memory, Edgar? There are 5 headline targets. One is employment, one is poverty. And in how does the Union address the achievement of those targets? It does so by using its resources to try and develop lighthouse projects and programs, exemplars for the kinds of initiatives that can be shared more widely across the member states, but also to work very closely in partnership with member states that are facing particular issues on the kinds of initiatives and programs that they can address. So, is it an issue? Absolutely. Is it the member state primarily? Yes. But the European Union takes an intense interest in what the strategies that can be pursued. Sorry, come back to you in a second. Yes,
can you hear me? Or is this working? I have actually a good example of this. The European Commission recently facilitated a project where the German companies actually are training Spanish companies on how to engage youth, because Germany is actually uses a very good example of having the post-secondary school program, whereas unemployment in Spain is absolutely at one of its highest levels ever. So I think this German-Spanish cooperation should be actually used as a positive example. But really, I mean, if you look at Greece, there are so many other countries which need this sort of cooperation, and everyone is now looking at the German model. Why is German kind of tertiary training, why is it so successful? The company placing its own practical hands-on training. So, and Germany is actually actively helping this. So it's an example of how European Commission has facilitated German-Spanish cooperation on this front.
So,
what's the accountability like on those targets? I mean, you talk about institutions sort of has institutionalised itself. You're then talking about setting very clear targets, and you said it was quite a direct response to that. Thing. What about the accountability to those targets? What happens when they don't make it? Might be quite negative in that, but what happens?
Well, I don't think there's a clear answer to that when you're talking at the overall macro level of strategy. the targets are real in the sense that there's an ongoing process of monitoring and reporting through various forums of the Union, the Commission and the Parliament on the progress towards the achievement of those targets. It's a bit like Australia though, you know, we're going to have a budget surplus, you know, if it's not achieved, you know, then there are good reasons for it or there aren't.
And that's exactly what
ultimately it's the ballot box that makes
Say
it.
there's no accountability in Australian politics.
Sorry?
Or it seems like there's very little lack of real accountability in Australian
I think
politics.
the accountability is the electoral process, isn't it? And that's ultimately where we will all make a judgment about whether or not those kinds of decisions, the movement of targets, are justified or not. So it's ultimately the democratic process. Now, getting Europe, obviously the democratic process is complicated again because it's got different levels. But that's ultimately where the accountability is. I mean, democracy is a core value, and whilst like in all modern entities, you know, what it looks like is going to be the subject of some debate. It's a issue.
Just a question
One
on the
last
youth
question on
unemployment. Internal labour movement, like we often talk about a European brain drain, or movements of young, well-educated people within Europe, but also leaving the European Union. Is it seen as a problem? Like, is it really as bad as they say it is, or is it okay within the confines of Europe because, you know, it is one labour market in certain senses, but Australia must be licking its lips, you know, where we need skilled people here. European Union or some of those countries have 30% youth unemployment, some even higher. Is it seen as a problem by the EU?
Well, I think the short answer is yes, but
Well, I should perhaps compliment. I'm a member of the European Commission and for the time being a fellow in the ANU, so maybe I can answer better to this question. I don't have the feeling that it's felt as a threat, a sort of brain drain from the EU to the US or to other regions. We are thinking very much that we need innovation in Europe. We need to put a lot of money into the research to make this area one of the most modern spaces. And these programs like Erasmus Mundi have been so successful that people have been moving around in Europe, meeting each other, making a lot of very positive experiences in other countries with other languages. I have a lot of examples of very young, very bright students going at the beginning of their career to the US, to one of the most famous universities, and then when creating a family, coming back. So we are not worried about this sort of exchange. We attract a lot of very good people. We have people going abroad to study somewhere else. So we are, I would say, not frightened about this.
okay, look, I'll hold it there because we need to keep moving on.
I don't think that Europe suffers a brain drain. Ireland does, and most of the Irish don't go to Switzerland or to Austria and so on. They come to Australia because of the language. But overall Europe, I don't think it's suffering a brain drain. In fact, I think it attracts people from outside of Europe to attend University of Berlin and work here. And I would love to know how many foreigners of other European countries also work in another country. I mean, I happen to know that my wife has a very distant Scottish relative who's been living in Munich now for 20 years. And there are lots of non-German speakers from other European countries working in Germany, and the same applies to other countries.
Let's hold those thoughts because we're going to